Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It is Wednesday, April 12th. And as you might know, Wednesdays, we like to talk about faith and the common good around here on the Common Good Podcast. And super excited to be joined by an author and also a person who is a therapist. So a nice combination in our world. Mark Karris is joining us. And Mark, good to see you. Nice to have you with us today.
Great to be here.
Hey, Mark, sometimes we chit chat about the weather, and I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it's, usually we are bemoaning and trying to look for a little sympathy from people. But today it's going to be 83 degrees and no humidity and light breezes and big sunny skies. I would call that a San Diego kind of day. For you, that's just, an average Wednesday, I'm guessing.
Indeed, although it's a little cloudy today, but San Diego is like the perfect 76. Yeah, that's the 80 something would be a little too hot for us, San Diegans.
That's right. You're like fine chefs when it comes to the weather. Right. You're adjusting the small number of degrees. All right. Well, Mark, we do a lot of things in our conversations here on the podcast. We talk about politics, we talk about faith, we talk about science and economics. All these things. And it really has to do with how people view the world, right? And the stories that are in our heads. We're much more interested in helping all of us have some new ways to think about the world. Not only new things to think, which is important, but new ways to think about it. And I feel like this book that you've written, The Diabolical Trinity, is something that's trying to do that as well. I mean, taking some really key issues. Is that right? Is that kind of how you're thinking about this book that you've written?
Yeah, it's Diabolical Trinity, Healing Religious Trauma from a Wrathful God, Tormenting Hell, and a Sinful Self. There's an emergence of what we would call just understanding of religious trauma, well, trauma in general, but now religious trauma. And a lot of books are coming out in the next year. And it's just something that we're seeing, something very concerned about. I experienced my own religious trauma, so that probably sparked some of my passion for wanting to write this book. But, I'm also kind of a researcher, and there's plenty of qualitative research as well, just anecdotally, that the notion of a wrathful God, a tormenting hell, where you could spend eternity being tormented or tortured, and just a view of self as primarily depraved or sinful or evil, that has what I would call deleterious effects and has caused significant trauma for many folks.
So, as I mentioned, you're a therapist. You're somebody who works with people in a counseling situation. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I'm actually an ordained pastor and a therapist. Yeah.
Yeah. Boy, there are an awful lot of people for whom the notion of a wrathful God, a tormenting hell, and a sinful self, those are core understandings to their religious idea, especially in Christianity, but not only. Christianity is not the only, religious system that talks about this. Maybe you don't want to make this distinction, but is it your therapy training? Is it your religious training? Is it your personal experience that has motivated you to want to remind people that a wrathful God, a tormenting hell, and a sinful self are not only the way we should understand the Christian story, but actually have this traumatic impact on people's lived experiences? Which one of your parts of your life has led you to this conversation?
Well, it's hard to piece out. It's sort of an integration. I love the integration of psychology, theology, and philosophy. So I'm sort of have this trifecta of passions, and mix in some neuroscience. And I just love the integration of it all. But really, the key thing that motivated me to write it was experiencing people in my therapy office. I'm no longer quote pastoring in an official context, but that's a whole story in and of itself. But yeah, just seeing the people come to me with tremendous suffering. I mean, it's hard to imagine because another person's theological trash is another person's theological treasure. So there's plenty of people who, praise God, angry, wrathful, God is just. It makes sense. We are sinful and depraved, and eternal conscious torment makes sense when you think of how holy, pure, and just God is. They're not the ones experiencing religious trauma. but there are people who have panic attacks, who have increased
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, who have incessant shame, have a fear-based self-critic who constantly kicks their ass, telling them to fear about the present and the future.
Yeah.
I had plenty of those, suffered through many of those. And there's what I call phantom theologies, which you
Nice.
may have heard, phantom limb syndrome, where a
Yeah.
person's arm may be cut off and it still could be there. But people years later, I haven't believed in that in 5, 10 years. I could still have nightmares about it. Something is amiss when a religion that promotes an abundant life and freedom and all that good stuff, that it could have this kind of effect. Something is amiss.
Look, and I think this is so important because those of us who've worked with people around these ideas know how deeply entrenched the ideas can
Mm,
be. I see in the
yeah.
chat we have, Jim and Trisha and Darlene and Alex. So people from Florida, Alberta, Canada, Southern
Mm,
Minnesota, Dan's in Michigan, I'm in Minnesota, like all over this country, all over the
mhm.
world, people believe these things. And I have been shocked, Mark, and I don't know if it's shocking
Mhm.
for you in your work, how much people want to hold to these ideas, even when they know how difficult and painful these ideas are and how much damage it causes to their psyche and their behavior. Like people don't let
Mhm.
go of this stuff easily. It's not as if someone's like, well, wrathful God, I don't know what other option there would be. No, they know
Yeah.
what other option there is, right? Which is
Mhm.
either just a non-wrathful God or a loving, caring God or a nurturing parent or something else.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet the swapping that idea, that core idea out doesn't come as easily as um, just providing an alternative story for someone. So there's something deeply rooted these ideas become deeply rooted in people,
That's
and I'm
right.
super
That's right.
curious about that. Do you have any thoughts
Yeah.
about what that rooting comes
Sure.
from, where it comes from, how it is?
Totally. Well, I mean, the way that I frame it is the reason why it's so difficult to uh, get it out of your mind, to think differently, to wiggle these hell beliefs, God, wrathful God beliefs out of your mind and psyche, is because it's not just in the mind; it's in the body. And this is the notion of trauma. And that's why information does not necessitate transformation. We can't, facts will not heal the tracks, as I say, the neuronal tracks within human beings. This is going at a much deeper subcortical nervous system level, where that's where these truths are embedded in memories, not just the prefrontal cortex logical stuff. So the brain's primary purpose is to keep us alive and free from pain. So think of this imprint in terms of what happens when a
Mm,
child touches a hot stove. The shock of the scorching heat's aftermath is a constant reminder: fear the stove, do not touch.
mm.
And likewise, the imprint of hell and a wrathful God would say, fear God, do not sin, right? And this is on the nervous system level. And one cannot be lectured out of this. You can't listen to enough podcasts or read books to get this stuff out of your system. And that is where neuroscience and trauma informed approaches to healing that gets into the nervous system. And that's why those are so important.
So I know we can't get into a full uh,
Mhm.
process of therapy here, but
Yeah.
for people who aren't aware, what's included in the trauma informed healing and body practice healings that have been helpful for people? If facts don't heal the tracks,
Yeah.
what do people do?
Sure. Well, yeah, this gets into some technical things, but I will say this. I'm so passionate about healing that part two of my book is really helping on a philosophical, sociological lens of deconstructing the hell narrative. So that's more, I'm like, that is kind of facts and
Mhm.
looking at, hell as being sort of this big dog who seems so fierce, but when it gets wet is a shaggy nothing. There's no power, but it's been used to. Yeah, there's reasons why it's evolved and has continued, and that's a whole other discussion. But in part three of the book is I spend over 120 pages on practical psychological
Hmm.
principles and pathways to healing. And so some of those, I don't want to get too technical, but one may be looking at the neuroscience around memory reconsolidation.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
sounds all heady, but to put it in a simple way, that if we have trauma based memories, let's say I went to a play when I was younger and I saw this, very terrifying picture of hell and demons, and you need to make a decision, and causing this ripple effect of influx of stress hormones and glucocorticoids, creating embedded this kind of fear-based memory. So memory reconsolidation would say we have an approach that could basically allow this memory to come up to the surface.
Hmm.
There's a window of time, about 4 to 5 hours, where it could be labile or open to change and being updated. And that by certain therapeutic processes, we can update and revise the actual memory
Mm.
itself, with particularly the emotional valence that surrounds the memory. And
Mm.
that's where we can go into imaginary work. So, just on a practical level, let's go back in time, and it doesn't have to, it could either be some people who choose to remain Christian. Let's use the prodigal God, a
Yeah.
one who sees far off and is looking and is compassionate and hugs and kisses. That's a pretty different God than I was taught and used to, and definitely not like my dad. But so we can use that. We can use an imaginary figure like Mufasa, an
Mm.
uncle, that can actually go back into the memory itself and do some incredible healing work there. So whether it's
Right.
imaginary
Right.
work, self-compassion work, inner critic work, you name it, there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, and it's super helpful. I've been thinking a lot about memory, partly because I listened to somebody who
Mm,
does memory work, and it's interesting to hear them talk about this. And maybe you know a lot about this, but there's a real question about when is it a memory and when is it a lived current experience, right? Like
mm,
how
mhm.
long does from an experience that we have does it stay in your body and your mind as something I'm experiencing right now? Like this sentence I'm saying right now is currently a right now experience.
Mhm, mhm.
But the sentence that you said 3 minutes ago is now in my memory, right? So somewhere there's a time moment where it moves from current experience to
That's right.
to a memory. But then when you remember it, it comes back and you're experiencing it again, right?
Mhm,
Because I mean, we
mhm.
can all practice that anytime you want. Think of something funny, think of something sad, think of something wonderful,
Yeah.
and you
Mhm.
start to bodily have, happy, sad, emotional experiences around it. So this real
Yeah.
question about how long does it exist and when can you remake memories and rework memories and this kind of deep trauma stuff
Yeah.
is super. I don't know. I find that to be really empowering just to know that our past is not
Mhm.
only our past, it also becomes our present when we remember it. Even the
Mm, mhm.
word to, making it a member of your
Sure.
life again, like it's,
Yeah.
it's again membered into your life. Is that some of
Yeah.
the work that you found helpful for people once they say wrathful God, tormenting hell, sinful self, that trifecta, or you call
Mhm.
it the diabolical trinity, a nice play on
Mhm.
words. Is that something that I mean, you mentioned already that some rememory work, but
Mhm.
there's a sense in which people, and I don't mean this term loosely at all. I mean it very carefully. They're re-traumatized by these memories and by these
That's right.
retellings. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes Easter comes around and people are like, good Lord, I thought I put that stuff away a while ago. But
That's
every
right.
time Good Friday comes, or I have to explain to my kids what we're doing on
Mm.
Easter, it's like, I don't even know how to, I don't even want to,
Yeah.
I don't want to bring it up again, that
Mhm.
kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, there's memories that we can just recall, and we can go through the details. It makes
Hmm.
sense. It's coherent, and there's not a lot of negative energy around it. There are traumatic memories which are, in a sense, frozen in time,
Mm.
that are not yet
Mm.
processed to completion.
Mm.
So the problem is that they could be, where in other memories there's a clear sense of beginning to end. Sometimes
Uh,
traumatic memories are a little bit more fragmented. There's not a full integration between the left and right hemisphere of the brain when it comes to these memories. So fast forward years later, there's a stimulus or a trigger So that I think of like if you have a bruise on your arm and someone brushes up against, ow, what the? And it's the
Mm-hmm.
same with the trigger within. It could be, I have clients who they could listen to or read something on Facebook. A friend wrote something on hell and progressives going to hell that literally then trigger them. All the stuff that they've dealt with years ago comes right up to the surface because there's a sense that there's no time. So what happened back
Mm-hmm.
then
Nice.
feels like it's happening in the
Yep.
moment.
Yep.
And literally, they can go into a severe panic. It's just this disorienting state, and it's a lot of suffering. People,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to understand unless you're in it. But yeah, and so the nature of memories and traumatic memories, that's in part which we have to work with. That's why I could tell, for example, if a guy or a woman was experiencing that, oh, God loves you, or there's no such thing as hell. Like logic is not going to do it. They could go in the mirror and tell themselves 100 times. We have to get into the memory itself, the trauma itself in the subcortical nervous system and work with that in an effective way.
Well, one of the pieces of work that we do around Vote Common Good when we are working with
Mm.
people on changing narratives that they want to
Uh,
change, like you, we don't think it's our job, nor does it work to try to have someone change their mind on something they don't want to change their mind on. Right?
mhm,
The
mhm.
best we can do, which is important work, is to help people who want to see a change to be
Yes.
supported in going through that change. So we're not
Mhm.
working to try to convince people to be different. We're trying to help people who want to be different to continue down that path. And
Yeah.
one of the things that we find important for people to recognize for themselves and for anyone else they're in conversation with is that it's not just the thing you believe, which somebody can say, here's the facts about what I believe, here's my understanding, here's maybe even the rationale I have for it. But there's
Mm.
another question, which is, what function does that belief have in your life? What does it do for you? How does it
Mhm.
perform? Because it
Mhm.
does something. So I want to
Yes.
tell you a little story and get your
Mm.
feedback on it.
Mm.
I have for a long time been asking people to set aside the notion of hell as a to recognize that it's not a Christian notion, it's damaging and should be set aside. So that
Mhm.
led me into a debate a few years ago in a formal debate setting in front of an
Mm.
audience where like opening statement, rebuttals,
Mhm.
and then back
Mhm.
and forth. And so I was holding the position that we shouldn't hold to a notion of hell. And there was a particular
Mhm.
person that I was watching in the audience, and I could see by her reactions that she was sometimes disagreeing vehemently with me. And then later I saw her start to tear up and had different kinds of emotions. So at the end of this debate, she came up and wanted to talk about some things. And I mentioned that
Mm.
I'd noticed these changes in her. And um, she said, look, I've been struggling with this for a long time, which is why I came tonight. But when I hear you say there is no hell, what I hear is God is not going to do anything about the wrongs that were done to me. And
Mhm.
I was
Mhm.
sexually abused and I want God to do something about it.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
for me, the function of summarizing her longer story, for me,
Sure.
she was saying, the function of hell is that God will do something about evil. And she said,
Mhm.
now I'm
Mhm.
realizing I need to find another way for God to do something about evil because that doesn't make any sense. But it was really enlightening for me that I could
Yeah.
come sort of strolling in and be like, in myriad ways, we can take this thing apart.
Mhm.
But when it's a load bearing wall in someone's house of belief and you start banging on that because its
Mhm.
function is that someday things are going to be made right. That's what
That's
they've
right.
assigned to that notion. So this is really
Mhm.
hard for people to let go of, not only because of trauma and internal body things they can't understand, but because
Yeah.
of the psychological framework, logic framework that people have put together, that these ideas
Mm.
function in a way. They explain something. They make sense of the world. They like
Totally.
they're not only functioning in a what did you call it? You had a D word for like a damaging way, not only
Oh, deleterious?
a
Oh,
deleterious
I
way.
don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're functioning in a very positive way. Like they're doing a thing that people
Oh
want
my
that
goodness.
belief to keep
Yeah,
doing.
yeah, yeah. Can I talk about that?
Please, yeah, all you
Oh,
want.
wow.
Yeah.
It really is fascinating when one looks at what is the function of hell? And in part two of the book, as I alluded to, I try to show that the internal torture chamber known as hell is like an intimidating, ferocious looking dog with mangy fur who, after getting wet, looks like a skinny, feeble, and downright laughable animal. But my aim is to demonstrate that hell does not originate from God, but is rather a result of human ponderings about the afterlife, morphing into a narrative of violent projections that binds communities together. And also, it helps feed human pride and
Mm,
is used by
mm,
people in power to subjugate dissenters. And I also deconstruct the notion of a violence prone God and eternal hell by exploring the absurd notion that our compassion, goodness, and wise discipline meter functions more adequately than God's. But two things that stick out to me in what you said is the function of hell. And I just did this again a
mm.
few days ago. I looked at every passage in the New Testament that eternal torture, conscious torture folks, infernalists, whatever you want to call them, use to say, hey, this stuff is real. Jesus said it.
Yeah.
And every single one, including a couple in the Hebrew Bible, although it definitely evolved, it wasn't prominent in the Old Testament at all. But what I found was every account, it's either doing two things. One, it's trying to inspire a traumatized community. That trauma and oppression from other people groups, from other tribes, will not have the last word. So it
Mm,
really is this encouraging, uh, you know, uh, hey, there's going to be an afterlife that you may be suffering now, but God's going to open a can of whoop ass, and your
yeah.
enemies, they're going to get rocked by the most powerful being in the entire universe. So that's one function, and you could look at the passages because
Nice.
that's what's the
Hmm.
context. But the other is, and this is the interesting piece too, which has caused so much, I believe, internal emotional violence. It's used to promote a homogenous sense of morality. And so every context you can look at, I think of the if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And but it goes on to talk about, eternal fire, right? Eternal hell in a sense. So you have these contexts where it's talking about hell, but it's talking about it in a way to promote cohesion within the community. So we can see how the evolution of hell makes sense. There are hell narratives not just in the Christian tradition, but first of all, religion is ubiquitous in every place on the entire planet. But also, you have hell and afterlife narratives,
Hmm.
whether it's not with a deity, but it started off with animism, and then maybe your ancestors, could be out there in the afterlife, and because you didn't do something in a particular way, they can come and punish you in some way. So what is that? It's interesting to take a step back. It's not like, so I get away from this, well, God said it. No, it has very human fingerprints around this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot of
Yeah.
interesting, details.
Yeah. I think I hear what you're saying, which is, look, the way any of us who hold stories that are harmful to us, we need multiple responses to those stories. Like, it's not one
Mhm.
thing, it's a variety of
Yeah.
things. We hold them in our bodies, we hold them in our memories. I know a lot of people I've talked to who, when it really comes down to talking about faith, Christianity in particular, which is a tradition that I work in, people will say, I'm willing to let all this stuff go, but it's kind of been important to my family and to my
Mhm.
people. So I don't want to, kind of
Mhm.
dismiss all of it. It feels, as you were saying, like you're breaking your bond with your community, or this was really important to my grandma, and my grandma really loved
Yeah.
me. And so I don't need to say my grandma was wrong about all these things that were so important to her. So you realize,
Mhm.
wow, this is really embedded in so many other stories and in so many other narratives that we all have,
Yes.
that we have to
Mhm.
go gently with ourselves and with others, right? Because
Mhm. Mhm.
that old adage that you can't argue somebody out of some idea they weren't argued into or whatever. I'm not totally
Yeah.
sure that's true, but people don't want you to, right? Like there's a
Yeah.
there's
Yeah. Yeah.
a human requirement of kindness and gentleness that
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
seems to be rooted in all of this.
Yeah. It's, when, as you're talking, I get moved to want to be so compassionate to people. I meet with a lot of pastors and leaders, and I had somebody, I will never mention a name, but someone very prominent who said, I couldn't, while I endorsed your book, because of the title, I can't tell people about it because I'm afraid of the
Hmm.
repercussions.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I was like, oh my goodness. But I meet with a lot of people, like I have so much compassion. It's not like I could just get out. Like livelihood, community, financially, there's a lot of the intricate web of connection that's involved around the religious beliefs. I just have so much compassion. It's easy to say, well, if it's aversive, just get out, but it's
Yeah.
complicated. So I take a very compassionate view in them.
So you've obviously been thinking about these things for a long time. When you were a pastor, I'm guessing you were thinking about these issues. Did,
Mm.
ha- have you chosen, like, do you know a time where you made a decision to say, I'm better in a therapeutic counseling relationship
Mm.
with people than in a pastoring leadership kind of relationship? Was that a decision you made, or did circumstances sort of present themselves?
Yeah. Well, when I think of the church, I think more of the people. And I feel emotional saying this, but I love the church. Not the institution. I love the people, and I had such rich and rewarding experiences. But for me, it was more I got kicked out. That was the. It's a very painful piece of my story. I didn't choose to leave. I would have loved to stayed and empower and encourage and inspire. But when I wrote my second book, which was deconstructing petitionary prayer and sort of asking the question, does praying for Aunt Mary 1,000 miles away do anything? And I had some interesting deconstructive things to say about that in that book. But the pastors that I was associated with in that church, they read it and they said, you can't be here. There's maybe some liberal churches down the road, maybe you'd be more comfortable. That really hurt. And then I tried one more time. I said, let me try another church, and it's the same thing. You can't. We can have you in the church, but we can't have you teach or do any workshops or but like I love to teach. So what happened was the church didn't want me, but then I wound up going to a university, Point Loma, as an adjunct, so teaching, this sort of integration of theology and psychology. I was like, this is this is great. I feel like I'm still pastoring, but it's
Hmm.
more in this educate people are hungry and let's wrestle, and it was effing beautiful.
Hmm.
Um, so I didn't choose to leave, but I feel like I got kicked out. So
Hmm.
I
So
refuse to
you
be
live with,
abused, and to be with a woman who doesn't want me. Yeah.
yeah, and that pain reshapes a person, doesn't it? Like that reality that the community that you believed was an inclusive, accepting community to help you be shaped and live
Mm.
well in the world, then said, as it turns out, because of the thoughts in your head, you're not welcome here to do the things you used to do.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah. It's
something. I'm
very,
sorry for you, and
yeah.
I'm sorry for all of
Yeah.
us who've experienced those
Right.
things
A
against
lot.
our desires. Um, so I have this ongoing question of, and people who
Sure.
watch this podcast and live stream a lot know that I tend to bring this up more often than probably should. But when I get someone like you, I really want your input on it.
Mm.
It seems to me that human beings are a unique species in that we self harm, and
Mm.
I don't know if we're the only species that self harms, but we certainly do it. And I'm curious as to what's going on there. Why? And it's not a one-off self-harm. It can be fairly consistent, both in short-term, immediate
Mm.
harm, and long-term decisions that we make that we know are harmful. And so it feels like a lot of these ideas you're talking about in the book, concepts that are harmful and hurtful, and vengeance and wrath and
Mhm.
explanations, tend to really be related to the fact that not only do we self-harm, it seems to be, I don't know, pretty
Mm.
consistent feature of the human
Mhm.
consciousness. Do you have
Mhm.
any thoughts about that? Do you have any thoughts about self-harm and why we do it and what we do about it?
Yeah. One interesting fact is, and this gets into my interest in the topic. I know this is going way out there, but on the topic of demons. So
Okay.
one would look at self-harm or these negative thoughts. And, I was in a church experience where, if you were had a down day, let's cast out the spirit of depression. So it was a very demonic centric kind of environment. But as far as self harm, there are animals who do self harm. This is from the book Ubiquity, that have OCD, that get depressed, that are suicidal, and that actually self harm. So it's interesting that it's also in the animal kingdom, which I also say, like, is that just an animal thing? Or, like,
Huh.
why would demons
Okay.
inflict,
Yeah.
you know, like,
Is
let me
it
terrorize
cats
this.
alone? Are cats the only animals you're talking about that self-harm? They seem like they would be
Oh
more
my
more like
goodness,
more
yeah.
like us.
The Yeah, Satan's creatures. Um,
Love cats.
yeah, so self-harm, I don't know. I mean, hurt people hurt people, but we also hurt ourselves.
Yeah.
I just look at it from a compassionate. It would be difficult to self-harm if you're embedded in a community full of love and support. But not only that, if you had, and there's a lot of research on attachment styles and insecure
Mhm. Mhm.
attachments, and so, you know, what's out of the heart the mouth speaks, and so maybe out of the heart also comes harming oneself. And this gets into shame. Shame is
Yeah.
probably a big factor, and shame says I'm no good, I'm tainted, I'm dirty, I'm a loser, I'm effed up. So if you have that view of self, so therefore, oh, why do people do it? So we're getting into hurt, trauma, pain, view of self, also view of others, because many times when you have such a low view of self, it has been done in a relational context, which is paradoxical because it's due to pain by people, but it's through people that we can experience the most healing. So it becomes a very difficult aspect to, wow, don't tell me to be in community again, or even talking to a therapist can be a daunting task. So
Yeah. Yeah, there's
yeah,
just so
it's a
much. I
complex.
mean,
There is,
yeah, it
yeah,
is. It is so complicated, the people who all of us, we have our own patterns, some of us like to fight
yeah,
because the makeup is important, couples talk a lot about fighting and then makeup sex, and it's the best sex of their marriage, like that kind of thing, right? Or I
mhm,
used to be an ultra distance runner, and part of the reason I want to run 50 miles or 24 hours or 100 miles is because the way your body responds after that's done is just unlike anything else, right? Like you put your body through a
mhm,
lot of pain and strain, hopefully not
yeah,
harm, but and then there's this healing thing that comes, and there's a lot of emotion that comes out of after harm. Like I don't know, there just it seems to be a feature in us that we need to figure out how to incorporate differently, because I
mhm,
feel like these core root ideas that we say to ourselves, that idea is harmful. It's harmful to children. Like I advise and beg
mm,
for any parents, please don't talk about wrathful gods and tormenting hell and sinful self to children.
mm,
It's just content that is not age appropriate to the development of a psyche of a human being
yeah,
at a young age. Please don't do it. Super hard. I know parents who really struggle because they're like, we don't talk about that. But then we go home and my brother or parents,
mhm,
grandparents or
mhm,
aunts and uncles talk about that stuff, and they see it as a real
mhm,
positive thing and not a negative thing and something a child needs
yeah,
to make a decision to respond to. So I don't know. It feels like we're never going to get to a place where it's safe, where everyone is seen, no one has to be afraid, and everyone has enough, right? Like that
mhm,
reality
mhm,
is not happening in the next 600 months, right?
yeah,
So in
yeah,
the meantime, we're going to harm. We're going to carry around ideas that are harmful and hurtful. They're deeply embedded in us. We make up stories to make sense of it. So
mm,
we're not going to get. I don't know. We're not going to get fully out of this conundrum that we're in. So with a few minutes left in our
yeah,
conversation, what do we do in the meantime? Those of us who can count the
yeah.
remainder of our life in the months.
Yeah. Well, Doug,
How
we're
does this
we're
go?
all screwed. Yeah, let's just be nihilists. It's all done for.
Well, that's a realistic option for an awful lot of people. That
Yeah,
one's well supported with arguments. What else
yeah.
might there be?
Well, I don't think suffering, yeah, in many facets will end anytime soon.
Hmm.
But it's all I could say is I'm alive. I'm here. You're here now. We're here now.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
what can we do as conduits of love to thwart any kind of diabolical, detrimental factors, influences, narratives? We can only be responsible for ourselves. I just know for me and my house, love will reign supreme. Compassion will reign supreme. And I think there's people like me and you and so many others that are pioneers, that are courageous, that are just trying to make a difference in the world. And it's not going to end trauma in its totality, but just giving a cup of cold water to somebody, man. I mean, that's so the small is the new big. And I just think there's so
Nice.
many choice points within our daily lives to really make a difference.
That's beautiful. Hey, can I ask you one more thing? As someone who's writing about this, choosing to be public about these
Mm.
ideas, you're a public persona. You're putting out books, which people can buy this one
Hmm.
and others. So you're
Yeah.
thinking probably about like how does this all work in the United States? It's
Mm.
curious to a lot of people that
Mm.
churches in the Christian tradition who
Hmm.
speak of a wrathful hell and a tormenting tormenting hell and a wrathful God and sinful self, the phrases you use for the book,
Hmm.
tend to do better. More people go to those churches than churches that talk about a caring, loving God, an eternity
Mm.
that is not based on merit-based actions and systems, and
Mm.
seeing people as beautiful creations of the beloved. Those churches don't have as many people. They don't have as much
Mhm.
money. They don't have as much interest. They're not doing the most
Yeah.
interesting things. The other churches that are saying this
Mm.
stuff, I mean, they can only go so far publicly, but deep down, you know it's there, are
Yeah.
full of people and are growing. And look, I mean, I've been at this stuff for 30 years
Mhm.
trying to talk about
Mm.
this stuff publicly, right?
Yeah.
And if you had said to me in 1983 when I got into Christianity, hey, in 2023, because I got into it as a teenager, in 2023, 40 years later, the conservative brand of hellfire and, brimstone stuff is going to be toned down just a bit, but that's going to be the successful version. I never would have believed it. What's your thoughts on this? Why do
Mm.
churches that are conservative and exclusivist and God judging tend to be full of people and vibrant, and the churches that are otherwise are like, hey, we got a
Yeah.
couple of dozen people here, and we're hanging on by our fingernails.
Yeah. I have a thought on that. This gets into the sociology of religion. It's interesting that there's a sociologist, Josh Packard, who did some studies on the de-churched, and then there's other sociologists of religion who say that the only way that Christianity is going to survive is if they have particular rituals and structures and rules. That was disconcerting in a way. In other words, it's not, they were pointing to the de-churched and the emergent church and all this, that they're not going to survive precisely because they don't have that. And so that versions of Christianity will ultimately be so watered down as to not have any sustaining value in generations to come. So the flip side of that is there's something to be said about our tribal brains, about needing structure. When you and then you put a society, and then you have pandemics and rumors of wars, and then what do people do? They want to feel secure. They want to feel safer. And it's just this human thing that while people might not say it outright,
Hmm.
my insides long for structure, black and white truths. I long for an omnipotent type of figure who's going to tell me what is true, what is right, what is wrong. And that rules and that structure, which is what tribes had back then. Like that's why our brains evolved to the point to go away from that would be a death sentence back in the day, when we were in tribes and stuff. So it was a very, this is who we are, identity. So it gets into reducing anxiety, an opiate of the masses. I see all this chaos in non structured wild debauchery out there, the more structured and boxed in that could be in this religious environment. We have the truth. I know who I am. I know who you are. I know where we're going. I know what the afterlife is about. So there's something very appealing about that primitive religious sensibility that
Hmm.
makes people want to stay in that kind of environment.
Hmm. It just seems to me that that progressives can create those kinds of things too, right? You can have the golden rule, and you can have an ethic of how you're going to teach people, and you can have real clear definitions of inclusion, that it's everybody and it's not just some people, and you can be very
Mm-hmm.
definitive about God. You don't have to, and I know a lot of pastors in really great churches that mostly nobody goes to, who are very much like, I'm not just out there like God's whatever and do, go run in the
Mm-hmm.
fields and breathe in, nothing wrong with that, but that's not what they're doing. They're saying,
Yeah.
no, I want you to know the story of a loving, caring, understanding God that's with you at every step and is the Emmanuel
Yeah.
that holds you close. And so they're not just like rule free. In fact, some of those churches have more doggone rules. It's like I've got
Mm-hmm.
to sign a user agreement before I can take communion. Like
Yeah.
they're all about
It's
rules.
probably growing.
Yeah, and nobody's at those. So I don't know. There's something. It.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been puzzling over this for decades. So I'm sorry to dump this on you. Like you're supposed to
I
explain to me
understand.
how this is happening, but
But
it's just
you're missing
wacky.
the stick component.
Okay.
When you read something like "Do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is," when you have this stick component of I am engaging in this sense of morality or structure within the church, because not only am I afraid of the judgment rejection from the church, but then we have not just a loving God, but a punitive God. So I may be more prone to do the right thing or to go to church out of guilt, or God may listen. If I don't,
Yeah.
I know people, I was that way myself. If I didn't go to church, I would feel guilty, and I would have thoughts that
Mm.
literally that God would punish me, that maybe that week he would withhold blessings or something bad would happen to me.
Right.
That's the religious virus. So you damn straight
Yeah.
I went to church a lot more often. So I just wonder if the stick component is just one factor in there. It's not everything, but it's a component.
Mm. Yeah, I think you're probably onto something, and the music's just better at those other places that say, like just literally. There's days where I think, and I've been a pastor for a long time. Look, I gave this a run
Yeah,
for 20 years, and most of the people that were part of the community
yeah.
that I pastored in Minneapolis, many of those people are not in churches now. A lot of them are, but probably the majority are not. They're sort of like, this was the last stop, and now I'm out. So
Mhm,
look, I tried it,
yeah,
and it's still puzzling to me. I'm
yeah,
currently
I
going to a
understand.
church and trying to be
Mhm,
part, because I actually want to be in a community where there's a group of people who are joining their lives together to do some things. I want there to be some collective music. I want there to be a shared story that we're a part of. I want us to cheer each
yeah,
other on. I want to be pushed beyond my boundaries, to have to connect to people different from me. There's all kinds of
mm,
things that make churches an attractive element, a
yeah,
thing.
that's
The
right.
fact that people want that, and I know people who are super progressive in their mindset, but they still go to conservative churches because they have more
Mhm,
stuff going on, and they're just like, I just
mhm,
don't believe what the pastor says or what the worship leader sings, or I'm about 30%, but that's good enough,
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
I don't know. There's like this real desire that people want these things, but it just seems like people don't want progressive religion. Like, all in all, my wife is a yoga instructor, runs a
mm,
great yoga studio. I want people go there all the time. They go on a there's no threat of hell or anything else there.
yeah,
They're just committed because they like it. And then people go to conservative churches and they seem to really like it. And then people go to progressive churches and they don't. And that is
mm,
just such a
mhm,
thing that I have been like, at some point,
yeah.
and I think it has a lot to do with the format, frankly, but I tried that for a lot of years, so I don't think it's enough. But boy, there's just something, because look,
What do you think
we
it
are
is?
comcomplicated, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
E
I just,
why aren't progressive churches becoming mega churches? I mean, I don't know,
because they
but,
want to. I mean, look, I'm around a lot of progressive leaders. They're not all like, "Hey, we just want people to be loose." They're like, "We want people to be committed. We want people to do things." Like
totally.
they're
Yeah,
doing it all. And
yeah,
yet, especially people who've been infected first by a conservative religious narrative. It seems
Yeah.
as if whatever antibodies were built up. No, I'm just making up a bad metaphor using biology, but it's they built up some antibodies to deal with that virus. That is just wiping out anything that even smacks or looks like it.
Yeah.
So I
It's
don't
so
know. It's been
that's
very
so
curious to me. I
interesting.
sit around on a lot of weeks and just be like, how come I can't find a church where there's a bunch of exciting people that want to go to a thing and make some magic happen together? Like, and
I wonder. I had a thought, and let me
yeah,
run this by you.
please.
I think, and this gets into a view of humanity. I believe just, we're like waves and particles. We can be, great sinners and great saints at the same time. But it's interesting. I wonder, without guilting, without coercion, without shame, without fear, within the teachings and the sermons and the doctrines,
Mhm.
would people, is too much of a good thing lend itself to, hey, if I'm loved, I could come, could not come. Oh, maybe I'll come this month, or that's, yeah, I don't like the music. Yeah, that was, I know he's preaching this. But if there's in another church with the rules and the fear and the guilt and the shame, and you're going to church primarily too because God's watching, I just wonder if there's something to that, like too
Yeah.
much carrot and not enough stick, and what that does for human beings, a lack of motivation or a lack of structure or lack of fear. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I wanna sort of put it on that people just want rules, but look, I know progressives who've tried, "Okay, we're just gonna tell you the rules, like, here's the rules." And they're all just
Yeah,
generous, like, I guess it reminds
yeah.
me of that Jackson Browne song called "The Pretender," where he has that line in there and he says, um, "I gave my heart over to the legal tender," and he has some line where he says, "True love could have been a contender." Like,
Mm,
how
mhm.
come like, it's really
Yeah,
something. Look, I'm
yeah.
a Love Wins guy, both the book and the
Right.
notion, and
Yeah,
all
yeah.
for all that. Making
Mhm.
quite a statement, I guess, if we say love wins, because it's not enough to motivate people to life and action together, apparently, in religious communities, maybe somewhere
Right.
else. And I spend a
Yeah.
lot of time in other progressive spaces, and I have no problem with them. I'm in them all the time, do this stuff. They're not all built around deep love either. Like
Mm.
love and
Yeah,
acceptance and agreement and welcome and all of that. I
yeah,
believe in it. I'm always going to believe it. I'm going to be a faith, hope, and love guy until I don't have control of my thoughts anymore. But
yeah,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it. I'm not sure it's actually a human commodity that people are willing to pursue. And I just wonder,
yeah,
as a therapist too, do you also feel
yeah.
that like you feel people sort of like, okay, all this love and acceptance thing, I'm not going down that road quite yet. Like, do therapists know a bit more about why
Mhm.
this is so hard for us to wrap our heads around it?
Yeah, I'm trying to wrestle with you, in the
Yeah.
moment here. There's so many components to it, but there's an intuition that says a lot of the glue that holds those communities together are the rules, are the rituals, are the fear, and suffering too, and an us and them mentality, in crowd, out crowd. It all becomes a certain glue that just holds communities together in a unique way. If you have
Yeah.
too much
Yeah.
love, and I just think it could
Yeah.
also be, yeah, I was honest with myself, and I say, I'm kind of selfish, now that I've gotten away from religion in that way. If I don't want to go to church, I don't want to go to church. I feel spoiled. I feel selfish. I know what it takes to be in community, and then honestly, it's too hard for me. I'm
Mm,
too much an introvert. Life is good. I don't necessarily need it. And I say, wow, that's interesting. You could be a privileged, spoiled, selfish person who just doesn't want to give that kind of energy to community and knows it's
yeah.
good in many ways. So I can speak for myself. Like, that's an interesting thing. If I had more suffering, and I had this notion that if I didn't go, God would punish me. If I didn't go, people would be upset or reject me maybe I'd be more prone to go.
Yeah. I guess it's like all these things we've been talking about and you've written about so well in the book are they're like these fake, they're like these cheap knockoffs, right? Like I think the wrath of God is a cheap knockoff for the love of God. I think that a
Mhm.
vengeful, a punishing hell is a cheap knockoff for having to have a world of justice. I think that, the
Yeah.
self hating in a sinful narrative is just a cheap knockoff of paying attention to yourself. It's just too
Mhm.
bad that the alternative to the cheap knockoff is actually seen as less valuable than the cheap knockoff. That's just so shocking to me after years of just
Yeah.
trying this stuff. Like, wow, because I wasn't raised in a religious system or religious trauma. I don't have any of this. I never believed in a wrathful God. I never
Wow.
believed in hell. I never believed in sinful self. I've been arguing
Wow.
about that the whole time. So
Yeah,
fair
yeah.
enough. I just thought partly personality, partly family and experience. I
Yeah.
wasn't raised in Christianity, and no one threatened me as a
Mhm.
child with eternal torment.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so I didn't have to embody it. So trying to say to people, and I'm talking about really good people, and you'll say things like, "Well, we're going to do this Christian thing, or it's going to be a church," and then you say, "And it's not going to have these components." Super progressive people will say to me, "Well, then that's not really Christianity." Real
Mm.
Christianity believes in a wrathful God and a tormenting hell and a sinful self. That so
Mm.
what we need to do now is do something not Christian because real Christianity actually is that. And I'm like, once again, the cheap knockoff is seen as the
Mm.
real thing. It's like somebody who eats Velveeta growing up, like I did as a kid. I didn't know Velveeta wasn't real cheese.
Right.
I didn't know that it was soy with a coloring and a
Yeah.
flavoring in it. I
Yeah.
didn't know. I still enjoy a Velveeta. I'm not down on
Mhm.
Velveeta. I just didn't know it wasn't made out of milk. So
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
people who are like the only thing they really know is this other version. And I don't know, Mark, I'm sorry to turn this into a therapy session. I'm probably gonna have to send you a check for $150 after the podcast, but it's just
Yeah.
bewildering to me how so I don't want to leave people in a sort of depressed state, but I see people in the chat. Kimberly, if I could come to Scandia, I'd love to. It's
Yeah.
just a little shocking to me that, I live in a major
Yeah.
metro area. Mark, I'm guessing you're close enough to all of San Diego and Southern California. And you think,
Mhm.
could I name 7 churches I could go to that would say the stuff we've been talking about that I would want to go to? Kind of tough, right? It's
It
a
is
little
it is
difficult.
very tough. I do find that people who wanna be pastors or shepherds or, leaders or somehow wanting to form Christian communities, they have one of the toughest jobs ever in
Yeah.
this day and age. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. And look, and I know that, and most of the places I've experienced are part of some progressives church-wise are part of a
Mhm.
denominational brand. So you
Mhm.
might be free to be whatever, but you're going to take it in the Lutheran package, the Presbyterian package, the American Baptist package, the Methodist package. Like
Yeah.
the
A tribe is a
packaging
tribe.
is set and the structure is there,
Yeah.
and you just have to be willing to go with that brand. There's not
Yeah.
like a non-denominational progressive brand that exists many places in and around. And
Mhm.
I'm bewildered by that. I spent
Yeah.
25 years trying to help that happen. It didn't happen. I was pretty sure it was just from a lack of talent from the
Yeah.
people like me that were trying to do it. But now I sort of wonder, I don't know, maybe there's something deeper going on, and maybe Christianity just doesn't make a good progressive organizing principle. But I just find that hard to. I'm not willing to give up that one quite yet, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, maybe some of the components in a pie chart. Yeah, what does that say that humans need, that sort of guilt or shame or coercion or
Yeah.
God or punishing God to have a sustaining community like that? It's an interesting conversation. I just love wrestling with you.
Well, thank you.
My
Thank you for it. There's the
Yeah,
book for people watching on the live stream, Diabolical Trinity. You
mhm,
can find it. Mark Karris is the author. If you're
yeah,
listening on the podcast, there'll be a link in the podcast to the book. So if you want a
yeah.
book companion for this journey that you're all going on, here's one. Thank you, Peggy. I appreciate that. Were you going to say something else, Mark? Because we do a little roll call and run down and thank people for their chats
No,
in the
no
comments.
worries. I was just my heart just go. I was just thinking about the pastors. So I work with
Yeah,
so
me too.
much grief, and I feel that grief, yeah, within yourself. Anyway,
Yeah,
just
I'm
my
with you.
compassionate heart is, yeah,
I'm not grieving. You're grieving. Okay. Thanks, Jim. Well, thanks, Mark, and Jim, and
You got it.
Darlene, and Trisha, Alex, Mary,
Yeah, thank
Yabbits,
you, everyone.
Peggy, Kimberly. I'm just going through the list of all the Indigo, Matthew, Roger Flyer. That's Kimberly already. Sharon. All these people that have Walter, people that are chiming in. If you don't see all these in wherever you're watching this online, it's because we do them on different Facebook places. Our preferred place is on YouTube. So if you'd all go to YouTube and watch our stuff, then you can all talk to each other. That's the place we'd love for you to be. If you want to be hearing and seeing each other's comments, we'd love to have you do that over there. And of course, get on the Vote Common Good mailing list. Kimberly, get on the Vote Common Good mailing list, because I was going to send you an email about what time we were on today, because we switched times, and regulars, we try to keep up with you all. So, all right, Mark, thank you so much. And hey, all, we'll see you tomorrow. We're going to be on in the morning with astrophysicist Paul Wallace and talk about space and important things. All right.
Cool.
All right, Mark, thanks.